May 7, 1945. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. General George S. Patton stood in the map room of his Third Army headquarters and stared at the red arrows marking Soviet positions. Outside, his soldiers celebrated. Hitler was dead. The Nazi surrender would be signed within hours. Church bells rang across liberated Europe. Patton wasn't celebrating. His intelligence chief had just delivered the latest reports. Soviet forces had stopped their advance toward Berlin, not because they couldn't push further, but because they were consolidating, digging in, fortifying positions. His eyes tracked the dispositions. 160 Red Army divisions stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The largest standing army in human history, battle-hardened from 4 years of the most brutal fighting the world had ever seen, and they weren't going home. Patton turned to his staff officers and said something that would haunt his career and possibly cost him his life. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later, within the next generation. Why not do it now while our army is intact and the beast is tired? The room went silent. What Patton saw in those maps, what his superiors refused to acknowledge, what the American public celebrating VE Day couldn't imagine, what would get him marginalized, demoted, and dead within months, was a truth so dangerous that speaking it made him more enemies in Washington than he'd made in Berlin. The Soviets weren't allies preparing to return to peaceful coexistence. They were conquerors preparing for the next war. And Patton was the only senior Allied commander willing to say it out loud. For 4 years, the Grand Alliance had held. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had subordinated their profound ideological differences to a single objective: destroy Nazi Germany. It was a marriage of necessity, not affection. Churchill had said it plainly when Hitler invaded Russia in 1941. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. By spring 1945, that marriage was fraying. Patton had spent the previous 8 months driving his Third Army from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Central Europe. His forces had covered more ground, captured more enemy soldiers, and liberated more territory than any other American army in the European theater. He understood logistics, momentum, and strategic position, and his strategic position now terrified him. The numbers told a stark story. The Red Army fielded approximately 12 million men under arms in May 1945, the largest military force ever assembled. They controlled territory from Poland through Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Eastern Germany. They possessed 35,000 tanks, many of them the formidable T-34s that had broken the Wehrmacht. Their artillery train numbered over 40,000 guns. They had conquered Berlin while American and British forces were still 60 miles from the city. Meanwhile, American military planners were already executing the drawdown. The War Department had begun calculating demobilization schedules before the ink dried on the German surrender. Soldiers with high point totals were boarding ships for home. Production contracts were being canceled. The American people wanted their sons back, and Roosevelt, then Truman, after Roosevelt's death in April, needed to redeploy forces to the Pacific for the final assault on Japan. Patton watched this happening and saw catastrophe in the making. His intelligence officers delivered reports that confirmed his worst fears. Soviet forces weren't behaving like liberators preparing to withdraw. They were installing communist governments in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. NKVD units were arresting non-communist resistance leaders who had fought the Germans. Officers who had dealt with Soviet liaison teams reported systematic looting of industrial equipment, forced conscription of German prisoners into labor battalions, and mass deportations to the Gulag system. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence chief, documented Soviet order of battle with meticulous precision. The reports noted that Red Army units were conducting reconnaissance beyond their designated occupation zones. Soviet commanders were surveying bridges, road networks, and rail lines in ways that suggested offensive planning, not defensive consolidation. They were positioning aviation units forward and stockpiling fuel and ammunition at advanced depots. Patton raised these concerns up the chain of command. His superiors dismissed them. General Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in Europe, was focused on managing the fragile alliance long enough to finish the job. Political leaders in Washington and London were exhausted from 4 years of total war. The American public was celebrating, not preparing for another conflict. Stalin was Uncle Joe, the tough but reliable partner who had borne the brunt of German military power. To suggest the Soviets might be adversaries rather than allies was politically toxic. It implied the war had been fought for nothing. It suggested the millions of Soviet soldiers who died stopping Hitler had done so as part of some sinister communist plot rather than in defense of their homeland. It threatened to unravel the fragile peace before it even began. But Patton had spent months dealing directly with Soviet officers during link-up operations along the Elbe River. He had watched their methods. He had studied their doctrine. He had noted how Red Army commanders treated occupied populations, and he had reached a conclusion that would make him a pariah. The Soviet Union represented an existential threat to Western civilization, and the window to confront that threat while holding overwhelming advantage was closing rapidly. What made Patton's assessment particularly inflammatory wasn't just its content. It was his proposed solution: strike first, strike now. While American forces were at peak strength, and the Red Army was exhausted from 4 years of attritional warfare. To his superiors, this wasn't strategic analysis. It was madness. The Allied leadership saw Patton's warnings through the lens of their immediate concerns, and none of those concerns involved fighting the Soviet Union. General Eisenhower was managing the occupation of Germany, coordinating with Stalin on partition zones, and preparing for the Potsdam Conference, where the Big Three would formalize the post-war order. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was focused on finishing the war with Japan, hopefully without the million American casualties expected from an invasion of the home islands. President Truman, barely a month into an office he never expected to hold, was trying to master the overwhelming complexities of leading the victorious alliance. Patton's aggressive stance toward the Soviets threatened all of it. Eisenhower privately described Patton's views as unthinkable and warned him to keep such opinions to himself. The press reported that Eisenhower considered Patton's anti-Soviet statements potentially catastrophic to Allied unity. When Patton continued voicing his concerns to visiting congressmen and journalists, his superiors saw not strategic foresight, but dangerous recklessness from a general who had always been difficult to control. The broader military establishment dismissed Patton's assessments for practical reasons. American strategic planning in early 1945 assumed Soviet cooperation was essential. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had based their Pacific War plans on Soviet entry against Japan, which Stalin had promised would come 3 months after Germany's defeat. Antagonizing Moscow risked losing that cooperation at the moment it mattered most. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea, over 1 million men, could be pinned down by Soviet offensives, saving countless American lives during the invasion of Japan. Beyond military calculations, there was genuine exhaustion with Patton himself. This was the same general who had slapped shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily, nearly costing him his command. The same commander who had almost derailed D-Day with ill-considered public remarks. The same officer who seemed psychologically incapable of keeping his mouth shut when silence served strategic interests. His superiors had tolerated Patton's brilliance in mobile warfare because they needed his tactical genius. Now, with Germany defeated, his utility was declining while his political liabilities multiplied. The American public certainly wasn't receptive to Patton's message. Life magazine ran photos of American and Soviet soldiers embracing at the Elbe River. Newspapers published stories about brave Russian allies who had suffered unimaginable losses defeating fascism. The nation was exhausted from 4 years of total war. Rationing was still in effect. Hundreds of thousands of families had gold stars in their windows. The idea of immediately fighting the ally who had borne 80% of German military power was not just unpopular, it was incomprehensible. Even within his own Third Army staff, officers worried about their commander's fixation. Some attributed it to combat fatigue. Others suggested Patton's aggressive personality simply needed an enemy, and with Germany defeated, he had found a new one. His rhetoric grew increasingly heated through May and June. He told journalists the United States had defeated the wrong enemy. He suggested to British officers that the Western Allies should rearm German prisoners and drive the Soviets back to their pre-war borders. Then came an opportunity to prove whether Patton was paranoid or prescient, and the evidence would not be what anyone expected. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about Patton's assessment of the Soviet threat. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about his warnings before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the strategic decisions that shaped the post-war world. Hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the political and military context right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The test of Patton's predictions came not through military confrontation, but through a series of escalating incidents that revealed exactly what kind of partner the Soviet Union intended to be. In late May 1945, Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia refused to withdraw from territory west of the agreed demarcation line. Patton's Third Army had actually reached Pilsen before halting on Eisenhower's orders, allowing the Soviets to liberate Prague. But Soviet commanders now claimed the entire country fell within their sphere of influence. When Patton's liaison officers attempted to coordinate the occupation according to the Yalta agreements, Soviet counterparts simply stopped responding to communications. Then came Poland. The Yalta Conference had promised free elections in Poland once Germany was defeated. By June, it was clear no such elections would occur. The Soviet-backed Lublin government was arresting members of the Polish Home Army, the same resistance fighters who had risen against the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising. Stalin had cynically allowed the Germans to crush that uprising in 1944 while Soviet forces waded across the Vistula River. Now, he was finishing the job the Nazis had started, eliminating any Polish leadership that might resist communist control. Patton's intelligence network documented what was happening. Colonel Koch's reports detailed the systematic suppression of non-communist political parties throughout Soviet-occupied Europe. NKVD units were operating mobile interrogation centers. Trainloads of prisoners were heading east to the Gulag system. The methods were remarkably similar to Gestapo operations, except now the perpetrators wore red stars instead of swastikas. In early June, Patton authorized his forces to provide discreet assistance to displaced persons trying to escape Soviet occupation zones. Third Army trucks accidentally wandered across demarcation lines, returning with refugees who would have otherwise been repatriated to certain imprisonment or death. Soviet commanders protested. Eisenhower ordered Patton to stop. Patton obeyed the letter of the order while continuing the spirit, a typical response from a general who had built his career on aggressive interpretation of instructions. The breaking point came in mid-June during a confrontation near the Austrian border. A Soviet patrol detained American soldiers who had crossed into Soviet-occupied territory while pursuing a group of SS officers attempting to flee to Italy. The Americans were held for 48 hours despite repeated demands for their release. When they were finally returned, They reported being interrogated about American military dispositions, troop strength, and equipment capabilities. The Soviet officers had been courteous but systematic, treating the encounter not as an Allied coordination issue, but as an intelligence-gathering opportunity. Patton drove to the location personally. He met with the Soviet divisional commander and delivered an ultimatum that his staff later described as barely controlled fury wrapped in diplomatic language. The substance was clear. Any further detention of American soldiers would be treated as a hostile act, and Patton's response would be immediate and overwhelming. The Soviet commander backed down, but he also filed a formal complaint with Moscow, which complained to Washington, which resulted in Eisenhower summoning Patton to headquarters for a dressing down. What happened in that meeting became the subject of conflicting accounts. Patton's diary describes a heated exchange where he presented Koch's intelligence summaries and argued that Soviet behavior proved aggressive intent. He allegedly told Eisenhower, "We have destroyed one totalitarian state to enable another to establish itself. I don't see how we can leave Europe in that condition." Eisenhower's response, according to Patton's account, was blunt. "George, you will keep your opinions to yourself. You will maintain correct relations with our Soviet allies. You will stop creating incidents, and you will recognize that grand strategy is determined in Washington and London, not at Third Army headquarters." But events were beginning to prove Patton right, even as his superiors tried to silence him. In July, the Potsdam Conference convened. Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, soon replaced mid-conference by Clement Attlee after Labour won the British election, negotiated the final shape of post-war Europe. Stalin made promises about free elections and democratic governments in Eastern Europe. He spoke about cooperation and friendship. He toasted the alliance that had defeated fascism. Meanwhile, his armies were consolidating control over 100 million people in a zone stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Patton watched these developments with grim vindication. He told his staff, "I told them. Nobody wanted to listen. Now we're going to pay for decades because we refused to act when we had the chance." He wasn't wrong about paying for decades, but he was wrong about whether anyone would act on his warnings. In August, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered without the Soviet invasion of Manchuria playing the decisive role American planners had expected. The need to maintain Soviet cooperation evaporated overnight. The Red Army's entry into the Pacific War, which came between the two atomic bombings, suddenly looked less like essential Allied support and more like Stalin opportunistically grabbing territory in the chaos of Japan's collapse. Patton believed this changed everything. The atomic bomb had made the United States overwhelmingly powerful. Soviet conventional superiority was now countered by American nuclear capability. The moment to confront Soviet aggression with a position of strength had arrived. But Washington had a different interpretation. The atomic bomb meant the United States didn't need to fight anyone. It was the ultimate deterrent, the weapon that would keep the peace through the sheer terror of its destructive power. Confrontation was unnecessary. Containment would suffice. Patton found this logic incomprehensible. He had spent his career understanding that wars were won by willpower, by the determination to close with the enemy and destroy him. Deterrence wasn't a strategy. It was a hope that hostile powers would behave rationally when history proved they rarely did. His frustration boiled over in September when he gave an interview to reporters in which he compared Nazi Party members to Democrats and Republicans, just different political parties that didn't necessarily represent ideological threats. The firestorm was immediate. Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of Third Army and assigned him to command the 15th Army, a paper headquarters responsible for compiling historical reports. It was a professional execution delivered with bureaucratic politeness. The vindication of Patton's warnings came in stages, each revelation more disturbing than the last. In September 1945, American intelligence officers began systematically debriefing German generals who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front. What they learned was sobering. Wehrmacht commanders described Soviet tactical doctrine in detail: massive artillery preparation, overwhelming infantry assaults accepting horrific casualties, deep exploitation by mechanized forces, and systematic destruction of anything that might support enemy recovery. This was not a defensive military. It was an offensive juggernaut designed to conquer territory and eliminate resistance. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, former head of German military intelligence for the Eastern Front, provided even more alarming information. He had spent years analyzing Soviet capabilities and intentions. His assessment aligned precisely with Patton's. The Soviet Union was preparing for eventual conflict with the West. Stalin viewed the Grand Alliance as temporary. His strategic objective was communist domination of Europe, and he would achieve it through subversion where possible, force where necessary. The Americans found Gehlen's analysis so valuable that they recruited him and his entire intelligence network. Within months, the Gehlen organization became the foundation of Western intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, a remarkable validation of Patton's warnings from officers who had been fighting the Soviets while American planners still considered them allies. Meanwhile, the pattern of Soviet behavior in occupied territories became impossible to ignore. In Poland, the promised free elections were indefinitely postponed. In Romania and Bulgaria, communist parties seized power through combinations of rigged elections and outright coups. In Hungary, Soviet security forces arrested opposition leaders. In Germany's Soviet zone, industrial equipment was being systematically dismantled and shipped east. $10 billion worth of reparations taken as machinery, railroad stock, and entire factory complexes loaded onto trains bound for the USSR. Churchill, who had harbored his own suspicions about Soviet intentions, delivered his Iron Curtain speech in March 1946. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, he declared. The former prime minister described exactly what Patton had been warning about 9 months earlier: Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat it posed to Western security. By then, Patton was dead. On December 9, 1945, his staff car collided with an army truck near Mannheim, Germany. Patton suffered severe spinal injuries. He died 12 days later without ever leaving the hospital. The official investigation ruled it an accident. Conspiracy theories immediately emerged, suggesting Soviet assassination or elimination by American intelligence services that found Patton's rhetoric too dangerous. No credible evidence supported these theories, but the suspicious timing, just as Patton's warnings were beginning to be validated, ensured they would persist for decades. What was beyond dispute was that Patton had correctly assessed Soviet intentions when almost no one else in American leadership would acknowledge them. His analysis of Red Army capabilities was accurate. His warnings about communist expansion proved prescient. His advocacy for confronting the Soviet threat from a position of strength anticipated the strategy that would eventually win the Cold War 45 years later. The strategic community began quietly reassessing Patton's judgment. George Kennan's long telegram from Moscow in February 1946 described Soviet ideology and behavior in terms that echoed Patton's warnings. The policy of containment that emerged from Kennan's analysis represented the compromise Patton would have hated, not rolling back Soviet power, but preventing its expansion. Yet it acknowledged the fundamental truth Patton had recognized in May 1945. The Soviet Union was an adversary, not an ally, and would remain so until either its ideology changed or its power was broken. Military planners began developing contingency plans for war with the Soviet Union. War Plan Totality, drafted in 1945, assumed conflict would begin with Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Later plans incorporated atomic weapons. The scenarios these plans addressed were precisely what Patton had warned about. He had been right, but being right hadn't mattered. The immediate aftermath of Patton's death obscured the significance of his warnings. Newspapers eulogized him as a brilliant but difficult combat commander who had helped win the war in Europe. His advocacy for confronting the Soviet Union was mentioned briefly, usually in the context of the controversial statements that had gotten him relieved of command. The dominant narrative treated his anti-Soviet views as an unfortunate example of how even great battlefield commanders could lack strategic wisdom. That narrative didn't survive 1948. The communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February, the Berlin blockade beginning in June, and the consolidation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe transformed Patton from controversial crank to vindicated prophet. Military historians began revisiting his statements from 1945. The warnings that had seemed reckless or paranoid now looked like prescient strategic analysis from an officer who had recognized the threat before his peers. The National War College began teaching Patton's assessment of Soviet intentions as an example of how tactical commanders could sometimes see strategic realities more clearly than political leadership. His observation that "we defeated the wrong enemy" was reframed, not as suggesting alliance with Nazi Germany, but as recognition that eliminating one totalitarian threat had enabled another to emerge unchecked. Students analyzed what might have happened if Western leaders had listened to Patton's warnings in May 1945, when American and British forces were at peak strength and Stalin's armies were exhausted. The consensus among most historians was that Patton's proposed solution, immediate confrontation with the Soviet Union, would have been catastrophic. American public opinion would never have supported it. The logistics of supplying a new war while demobilizing from the previous one would have been insurmountable. The moral legitimacy of attacking a recent ally would have been questionable at best. And the atomic bomb, which Patton didn't know about when making his initial warnings, changed the calculations entirely by making total war suicidal for both sides. But his diagnosis of the problem was undeniably correct. The Soviet Union did represent an existential threat to Western civilization. Stalin was establishing totalitarian control over Eastern Europe. The Red Army was positioned for offensive operations, not peaceful coexistence. And the window for confronting Soviet power from overwhelming advantage did close rapidly as American forces demobilized and Soviet forces consolidated their position. The cost of ignoring Patton's warnings would be paid over 4 decades. The Cold War consumed trillions of dollars and millions of lives in proxy conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan. Eastern Europe suffered under communist tyranny for 45 years. The nuclear arms race brought humanity to the brink of extinction multiple times. All of this might have been avoided, or at least mitigated, if Western leaders had recognized in 1945 what Patton saw clearly. The Grand Alliance was dead, and the next great conflict was already beginning. Patton's reputation underwent posthumous rehabilitation. His biography became required reading at military academies. His campaigns were studied as examples of operational brilliance, and his warnings about the Soviet threat were analyzed as a case study in strategic foresight, the ability to see beyond the immediate tactical situation to recognize larger patterns and emerging threats. In 1970, the film Patton won 7 Academy Awards and introduced a new generation to the controversial general. George C. Scott's portrayal emphasized Patton's complexity: brilliant and profane, visionary and reckless, capable of extraordinary insight and catastrophic judgment errors. The Soviet threat he warned about would finally end in 1991. Patton had been dead for 46 years. The story of Patton's warnings reveals a fundamental tension in military and political leadership: the difference between being right and being useful. Patton was right about Soviet intentions. His analysis of the threat was accurate. His assessment of the closing window of opportunity was prescient. But his proposed solution was politically impossible and potentially catastrophic, which made his correctness strategically irrelevant. This is the paradox of strategic foresight. Seeing the future clearly doesn't matter if you can't convince others to act on that vision. Patton understood Soviet behavior, but failed to understand American political reality. He recognized the military threat, but misjudged his nation's capacity, both logistical and psychological, to confront it immediately after the most destructive war in human history. His tactical brilliance didn't translate to political wisdom. Yet history suggests that being ignored when you're right is sometimes more valuable than being heeded when you're wrong. Patton's warnings, dismissed in 1945, were vindicated by 1948 and shaped American strategic thinking for the next 4 decades. His voice, silenced by relief of command and then death, echoed through the policy debates that produced containment, NATO, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet system he had recognized as fundamentally aggressive and ultimately unsustainable. Sometimes the prophet needs to be marginalized for the prophecy to be heard. May 7th, 1945. A general sees the next war beginning, while his nation celebrates the last one ending. He speaks the truth no one wants to hear. And history proves him right at the cost of everything he warned about coming to pass. Superior intelligence matters, but timing and political judgment matter more. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II and the early Cold War that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? More about the tensions between Allied commanders or the intelligence operations that shaped the early Cold War? Let me know in the comments below.